In a live studio built to script every word, Jasmine Crockett walks in as the guest only to be blindsided by Jeanine Pirro's on-air attack. Jeanine brands her a race hustler, demanding, are racial justice advocates truth-tellers or manipulators tearing the country apart? But within minutes, Jasmine unleashes raw, unedited proof no camera cut can bury. The audience is frozen, the control room in chaos, and Jeanine vanishes from the network, her silence screaming guilt. What did Jasmine expose that was so explosive it erased a judge from TV overnight? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The email landed in Jasmine Crockett's inbox at 7:14 a.m., crisp and clinical, with the subject line, Justice and Truth, Special Invitation. It carried the signature of Jeanine Pirro's producer, dressed up in polite formality, but pulsing with a hidden edge. The show's theme for the night was stamped in bold, those who exploit race to politicize America. The bait was obvious, but it was bait wrapped in gold foil, national prime time, live audience, and the kind of exposure most politicians craved. Jeanine wasn't offering a conversation. She was offering a stage to hang Jasmine in the court of public opinion. The subtext was razor sharp. Paint her as a race hustler, a woman who built her career on grievance and outrage, then watch her squirm under the lights. Most people would have called their team, drafted a response, and weighed the risk. Jasmine didn't call anyone. She closed the laptop without replying, then 15 minutes later sent back a single line. I'll be there. No entourage, no press plan, just her, a classified folder, a USB drive, and a silence so cold it could frost glass. She knew walking into that studio would be like stepping into a trap, but she also knew a trap, if handled right, can be turned inside out. She stepped onto the set with the deliberate calm of someone walking into a room wired to explode. Every move precise, every breath measured. The studio lights bore down with an intensity that didn't just reveal it interrogated. Jeanine Pirro sat at the desk like a judge returning to the bench, her smile tight, her gaze sharp, the kind of look meant to draw first blood. The director's hand sliced through the air, the theme music swelled, and the red light above the main camera snapped on. Jeanine leaned in, elbows planted, her voice sliding into the microphone with a sting designed to wound. You call fighting the police justice? Do you represent the law, or just Twitter? The words weren't meant to invite an answer, they were meant to define her opponent before she could speak. Jasmine didn't blink. She held Jeanine's gaze with the steady focus of someone who knew that silence could be a weapon. The pause stretched, the tension coiled tighter until her voice broke through low, measured, unshakable. I represent the truth, she said, the words slicing through the air with surgical precision. Then, without breaking eye contact, she added, and it seems that truth makes some people who once held the gavel very uncomfortable. Her tone stayed calm, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked. The only sound in a room suddenly locked in place. The cameras pushed in closer, freezing the scene into two faces, two wills, and a collision that everyone knew was coming. The shift in the room began with something almost imperceptible, a small, calculated motion from Jeanine as she turned slightly toward the control booth. The floor director caught it instantly, relaying the cue to the technical team. A faint click of relays followed, and the light above camera 2 softened to a cooler hue, casting the desk in a sharper contrast. Behind Jeanine, the massive LED wall jolted awake, washing the set with flickers of movement and sound. The first image was Jasmine frozen mid-sentence, one hand raised, eyes locked in intensity. But before that moment could breathe, the picture fractured. Her voice was chopped mid-syllable, spliced into a fast-cut montage that bled into shaky footage of restless crowds, flashing red and blue lights, and the low, pulsing hum of sirens. The edits were rough enough to be obvious, yet smooth enough to pass for reality to anyone who wasn't looking too closely. Every pause in her speech was overlaid with a chorus of angry shouts. Every gesture of emphasis was slowed down, reframed to look like orders to an unruly mob. Midway through the clip, the most damaging segment hit the screen. It was lifted from a speech on voting rights, a moment where Jasmine had urged persistence in legislative battles. We cannot stand still if they block the doors. We push through. In truth, she had been talking about political obstruction in Congress. But here in Jeanine's broadcast, the line landed over footage of protesters clashing with police, turning civic resolve into a call for street confrontation. The craftsmanship of the smear was deliberate, almost surgical, cutting away her intent and stitching in a narrative of danger. In another sequence, Jasmine was filmed glancing across a peaceful crowd, her eyes searching for the next person to speak. The editors replaced her view with a close-up of a man shouting into an officer's face, timed perfectly so it looked as if she was meeting his gaze with approval. Even the soundscape had been engineered. Faint pops, like distant fireworks or tear gas canisters, bled under her voice to make the air feel charged with unrest. It wasn't just distortion, it was prosecution by montage. When the screen finally dissolved to black, the silence lasted half a second too long, as if the room needed to catch its breath. Jeanine turned back slowly, letting the weight of what had just been shown settle over the audience. Her lips curved into a smile that wasn't warmth but victory, a silent claim of control over the narrative. She leaned in slightly, just enough to erase any sense of detachment. "You're not fighting for justice," she said, her voice carrying the measured satisfaction of a verdict already decided. Then she paused, not because she needed to, but to make sure the next words would sting. "You're just chasing cheap applause." The reaction was instant. Applause erupted, sharp and synchronized, echoing off the studio's high walls. Some in the audience leaned forward in their seats, clapping harder than the rest, feeding off the confrontation. The sound filled the space like a rising tide, washing over the desk where the two women sat. Jeanine allowed it, even basked in it, her eyes sweeping the crowd as if to confirm her hold over them. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't glance at the blank screen behind them or at the rows of clapping faces. She sat anchored, posture straight, eyes steady, the faintest shadow of a smirk beginning to form. Slowly, she tilted her head to one side, a motion so controlled it seemed to sharpen the air between them. The smile that followed was slight, calculated, and never touched her eyes. When she spoke, her voice cut clean through the noise, steady and unhurried. "You want to play the editing game?" "Fine," she said, her tone smooth yet edged like tempered steel. She let the silence hold for a heartbeat longer, making them wait. "But when you cut, don't forget to leave in the parts that make you look bad." From her bag, Jasmine drew out a small black USB drive, nothing remarkable at first glance. But in the tense stillness of the studio, it might as well have been a weapon. The metal casing caught a streak of light from the overhead rig, a flash that made the eyes of the nearest producer flick toward it. Jasmine didn't look at Jeanine. She didn't need to. Her voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the space like the first drop of rain before a storm. "I have something," she said, her tone almost conversational, yet so deliberate that it carried across every corner of the set. She slid the USB across the polished desk with a slow, unbroken motion, letting it stop just short of the producer's hand. "Play this," she instructed, her eyes never leaving the camera directly in front of her. Then, as if anticipating hesitation, she added, 90 seconds, no cuts." The words landed like an order, not a request. A faint ripple moved through the control booth, a glance exchanged, a hand hovering over a switch before the technical director gave a small nod. The LED wall behind them blinked to life, its glow spilling over the stage like the opening of a vault. The footage began without fanfare, no graphics, no transitions, just the raw, unpolished eye of a backstage camera. The date stamp in the corner read, Justice Pirro, March 2020. Jeanine was there, off the clock but still in full studio makeup. Mic switched off, leaning back in her chair between segments. Her posture was relaxed, the performance mask set aside for a moment. She lifted a glass of water, laughed lightly at something off camera, and then the line came out clear, unambiguous, and lethal in its casual delivery. "I don't care about the truth, as long as the ratings are high." The sound in the studio collapsed into absolute silence. Not the polite quiet of an audience listening, but the heavy stillness of people realizing they were watching something that shouldn't exist. The audience members sat frozen in their seats, their eyes flicking between the towering screen and the woman sitting just feet from it. The crew in the shadows stopped moving, as if even the softest step might break the moment. Jeanine didn't look at the footage. Her eyes stayed locked forward, her jaw tightening in slow, almost imperceptible increments. She had been in live television long enough to know that sometimes stillness could save you, but right now, her stillness looked less like control and more like being cornered. Jasmine didn't turn toward her either. Her body remained angled toward the main broadcast camera, the one transmitting this moment into millions of homes. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and who she was speaking to. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was sharper than before, every word measured to cut. Nobody turns the cameras off when the truth just came on. The sentence hit the air like a blade unsheathed. The phrasing was simple, but the intent was surgical. It wasn't just aimed at the control booth. It wasn't even solely for Jeanine. It was for the network executives watching from offices, for the viewers sitting on their couches, for anyone who had ever been told that truth was a matter of ratings. The way she held the final word on turned it into a challenge, a warning, and a verdict all at once. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the whir of the cameras seemed to have dimmed, as if the equipment itself understood the weight of what was unfolding. This wasn't just live television anymore. It was the kind of moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered long after the lights went down. The 90 seconds Jasmine had demanded were almost over, but the effect of what had been shown and what had been said was only beginning to take root. The studio was already trembling beneath the surface, though no one had yet dared to name it. The last clip Jasmine had played, the behind-the-scenes confession about chasing ratings over truth, had detonated something foundational. But she knew that structural lies don't just collapse from one blow. They need to be torn down, beam by beam, until all that's left is the wreckage of unchecked power. She returned to her seat slowly, with the composure of someone who understood that silence, once armed with truth, could be just as lethal as any outrage. But she wasn't finished. Not while the myth of Jeanine Pirro's moral high ground still hovered like a fog over the set. The pages had been waiting under her notes all along, unfolded only when the moment was sharp enough to cut through pretense. With quiet finality, Jasmine reached beneath the polished surface of the desk and removed a thin, manila folder. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Some truths don't require volume-only clarity. She placed it in front of her with the care of someone handling evidence, then slowly raised it, letting the DOJ letterhead catch the overhead lights. There was no need to hold it up to the camera. The words would carry farther than the image ever could. Her voice sliced through the room with the unflinching control of a closing argument. This is a copy of the federal criminal investigation into your attempt to plant a listening device in your ex-husband's car. You, a sitting judge, trying to wiretap your own spouse, violating federal privacy laws, and using your position to manipulate the legal system for personal revenge. No dramatics, no yelling, just the sound of a foundation cracking in real time. Across the studio, the producers froze mid-motion. Even the camera crew, so used to remaining invisible, suddenly found themselves holding their breath behind viewfinders. The tension was no longer between two political adversaries. It was between the facade of integrity and the reality that now stood exposed. Jasmine didn't rush. She let each word settle like dust on marble, and then stepped forward, placing the file on Jeanine's desk, not tossed, not slid, but set, directly and deliberately. Her eyes never left Jeanine's. The light that had once cast Jeanine as a seasoned veteran now exposed something different. The fine cracks forming in her expression, the subtle clench of her jaw, the brief flicker of her pupils searching for an off-ramp. There was none. Jasmine's voice dropped, only slightly calm, precise, lethal. You sat on the bench and called yourself an officer of the law, and yet here's your legacy: illegal surveillance, abuse of authority, and weaponizing your power for petty vengeance. That line didn't just sting, it dug, because it wasn't just about the past, it was about the present, about the audacity of someone who had violated trust, claiming the right to question someone who had built her career exposing such abuse. Jasmine had been dragged into this studio to be dressed down, reduced to sound bites. But now she stood with receipts while her accuser sat wordless. She gave the folder a single quiet tap with her index finger, then posed the final question not for Jeanine, but for everyone watching. That's the ethical foundation you brought with you to this broadcast? And with that, the room froze. Not figuratively, not atmospherically, actually froze. Jeanine didn't respond. Couldn't. Her throat moved, as if trying to swallow back the avalanche behind her silence, but her lips never formed a word. Her shoulders, so often squared with performative certainty, slumped just slightly. The facade wasn't cracking anymore. It was crumbling. The camera, operating on instinct and a gut-level sense of history being made, zoomed not on Jeanine's face but on her hands. And there it was, the unmistakable tremble. One hand rested beside a glass of water, the other hovering just above it, fingers twitching, grasping for a kind of control that wasn't there anymore. The glass shook faintly on the surface, just enough for the audience at home to notice. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because in that moment, the truth spoke for itself. And for once, no one tried to interrupt it. The tide had already shifted. Jeanine Pirro, once untouchable with years of courtroom clout and cable news swagger, now sat in plain view, her silence saying more than any comeback could. But Jasmine Crockett knew this wasn't just about calling out hypocrisy. This was about something deeper, the way the system didn't just overlook certain failures, it rewarded them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her posture. She simply reached for a small black remote resting near the moderator's station. Her thumb hovered for a moment over one button. When she pressed it, it wasn't for show, it was judgment. The screen behind them lit up with footage from the network's own archives, stamped October 3rd, 2020, 9:03 p.m., an episode of Justice with Judge Jeanine that went viral for all the wrong reasons. No dramatic intro, no music. Just a raw, unedited feed of Jeanine sitting in her chair, eyes unfocused, blinking too much. She tried to read from the teleprompter, but her rhythm was off. Her words slurred. We have, what looks like a foreign, manipulation of our democratic, her voice drifted away. She laughed awkwardly mid-sentence, then waved off camera. Just roll it, she mumbled. But nothing rolled. Someone off-screen tried to cue her. She started over, stumbled again. Millions watched live, confused, then unsettled. Was she drunk? Sick? The clip ended with her sitting there in silence, blinking slowly, unaware her mic was still on. And then came the spin. The next day, Fox News blamed it all on technical difficulties with remote broadcasting. No mention of intoxication, no owning up, no apology to viewers or staff. A week later, the moment had been scrubbed from their history, gone from their archives, never to be mentioned again. Jeanine was back the following Saturday, put together, unapologetic, untouched. But for millions of women, especially women of color, who had been punished, sidelined, or humiliated for far less, that moment never disappeared. When the screen faded to black, Jasmine didn't move an inch, but the air in the room felt different. This wasn't awkward silence. It was the silence of being called out. She wasn't just talking to Jeanine anymore. She was speaking straight to an industry that had long treated professionalism as something white, rigid, and cold, something she had been told she didn't measure up to. Jasmine looked straight into the camera, her voice calm but steady. I was once told I wasn't professional enough to deserve this seat. She paused not for effect, but so the words would sink in. But the woman who couldn't finish a sentence on live TV because she couldn't control her own condition, she kept her slot. She got defended. She got protected. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in certainty. Is that a double standard or just tradition? The words landed like steel. They didn't need to be shouted, they weighed enough on their own. In that moment, the studio didn't feel like a TV set anymore. It felt like a courtroom. And Jasmine wasn't just answering questions, she was cross-examining. The truth had been shown, and not even Jeanine Pirro could edit it away. The final seconds of the damaging broadcast clip still lingered in the air when Jasmine, without breaking her stance, reached down to the corner of the desk. Her fingers closed around a slim, matte black binder, its weight deceptive for something so thin. She set it down with a muted tap, the kind of sound that drew eyes whether you wanted to look or not. With a precise flick, she opened it, revealing two large glossy printouts. The pages were enlarged to the point that every pixel, every comma, and every keystroke was crystal clear under the glare of the studio lights. She lifted the first page high enough for the overhead camera to catch, angling it so the live broadcast audience at home could read along in real time. In bold, unmistakable text, the line stared back at millions. Black guests equals cheap ratings. The reaction was instant, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. She didn't give the air a chance to settle before turning to the second printout. Her voice was steady, deliberate, as she read the next line. As long as they yell into the camera, we have an audience. The ugliness of the words didn't need embellishment. They carried their own poison. Lowering the pages, Jasmine let them rest against the desk for a moment, her gaze never once breaking from Jeanine. Then she straightened, drawing herself to full height, and slowly scanned the faces in the audience left to right, row by row, letting the silence stretch until the weight of the evidence pressed on everyone present. When her eyes finally locked back on Jeanine, her voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. If this is how you select your guests, she said, each word sharp enough to leave a mark, then who's really exploiting race for profit? The impact was immediate. A low rumble of voices rolled through the crowd, building into a wave of disbelief and anger. Someone in the back couldn't hold it in any longer and shouted, clear enough for every microphone to catch, "How are you still sitting in that chair?" The line sliced through the murmurs, hanging in the air like a thrown challenge. And for a long, loaded beat, it wasn't just a studio, it was an arena, and every person in it could feel the ground shift beneath them. The shout from the audience, "How are you still allowed to sit here?" did more than just break the room's tension. It stripped away the last bit of authority Jeanine Pirro had been holding on to. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was sharp, pressing for an answer, not because people were curious, but because they wanted her to be accountable. Jeanine froze for a second, blinking fast, like she was trying to rebuild the on-air persona she'd relied on for years. Her fingers dug into her cue cards, which now meant nothing after everything that had just been exposed. She took a tight breath, leaned forward, and reached not for honesty, but for control. "This is a smear campaign," she said. It didn't hit the way she thought it would. The words were supposed to sound strong and outraged, but they came out thin and shaky. It was a voice from someone cornered, not someone confident. The claim collapsed almost as soon as it left her mouth. Nobody gasped. Nobody even whispered. They just stared, still and focused. They had already seen the leaked emails. They had already heard her admit her real priorities. Now they were watching her respond with nothing but blame shifting. Her line, "This is a smear campaign," barely hung in the air before it disappeared completely. It didn't stick, not because she was quiet, but because no one believed her anymore. The quiet that followed wasn't the kind you get when people are shocked. It was the kind you get when they've already made up their minds. That's when Jasmine moved. No big gestures, no drama. She just stood up, straightened her back, and walked forward steady and sure across the space that used to divide the host from the guest. That divide didn't exist anymore. Jasmine had already erased it with proof, with composure, and with a kind of strength that couldn't be shaken. She stopped right next to Jeanine's desk, standing tall, looking straight ahead, not just at Jeanine, but at the crowd, the cameras, and the people watching from home. "This isn't a campaign," she said, her voice clear and even. "This is justice finally seen in full light." The line landed hard, not because she shouted it, but because everyone knew it was true. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't for show. It was the truth out in the open where no one could hide it again. In the control room, voices overlapped in panic. "Cut now. Go to break. Switch to camera 3, get her off frame." Hands hovered over buttons. The director's voice cracked through the crew's earpieces. "Break now." But nothing happened. The broadcast kept rolling, because even with all the systems designed to protect the network, nothing was built to stop this truth that wouldn't back down. Jasmine stayed still. Her eyes didn't leave the lens. The camera stayed on her, not because it was ordered to, but because it was obvious where the real story was. And in that moment, the set, the desk, the lights, the crew, the audience no longer belonged to Jeanine Pirro. It didn't belong to the producers. the advertisers, or the commercial schedule. It belonged to Jasmine. And the light she had switched on wasn't going anywhere. The studio lights had barely cooled, the closing credits still fresh in viewers' minds, when the aftershocks began hitting the network like a chain of detonations. The confrontation wasn't just trending, it was detonating across the country in real time. Inside glass-walled boardrooms hundreds of miles from the studio, three of the network's biggest sponsors were holding urgent, closed-door meetings. These weren't routine marketing calls. They were war rooms. Legal teams sat with thick contracts spread across polished tables, pages marked with neon tabs where exit clauses lived. PR executives had crisis statements drafted but not yet approved, waiting to see how bad the bleeding would get before they pulled the trigger. The conversations were blunt. Brand alignment wasn't just jargon here. It was the polite term for, do we want to be tied to this mess? Spreadsheets of projected revenue losses sat open on laptops, columns highlighted in red. Someone in one meeting read aloud the most recent headlines, sponsors' names mentioned alongside words like bias, manipulation, and racial exploitation. The room went quiet. In an industry where image was as valuable as product, that kind of association wasn't just inconvenient, it was poison. Every minute they delayed a decision was another minute their brand was trending for all the wrong reasons. The decision was no longer if they would act, but how fast. While the sponsors were calculating risk in numbers and brand equity, another far more dangerous front was opening this one in the court of public credibility. By mid-morning, a coalition of former federal prosecutors, dozens of men and women who had spent decades in real courtrooms, arguing in front of real judges, released an open letter. It wasn't padded with polite language or vague generalities. It read like a verdict. Just 4 lines, each one clean and sharp, the kind of sentences that leave no room for counter-argument. This is a moment where justice defeated manipulated media. Those words didn't just appear on legal blogs or in the inboxes of journalists. They exploded across every newsfeed and legal forum in the country. The signatories weren't anonymous. They were names with weight: former U.S. attorneys, district attorneys, special prosecutors, people who had prosecuted mob bosses, corporate fraud, public corruption, people who knew exactly what manipulation looked like because they had dismantled it case by case. The legal world took notice first. Within hours, law professors were quoting the letter in lectures, courtroom journalists were threading it into analysis pieces, and civil rights attorneys were pointing to it as a cultural benchmark. But it didn't stop there. Talk radio hosts read it aloud on air. Cable news anchors put it up on split screens next to clips of Jasmine's confrontation. The words became a rallying cry, tweeted and reposted until they were stamped into the public consciousness. Inside the network, panic wasn't creeping in, it was flooding every hallway. The sponsorship team knew what 3 departing advertisers meant. Not just lost revenue, but a public signal that the ship was leaking. The legal department knew what the prosecutor's letter meant, that the narrative had shifted from a TV moment to a documented example of systemic bias, endorsed by the highest legal credibility available. And the producers, those who had sat in the control room the night before, knew something else, that the moment wasn't over. It was metastasizing. No one in those corporate or legal circles cared about Jeanine's on-air protestations. This is a smear campaign, had already been tried and discarded in the court of public opinion. The sponsors weren't weighing her feelings. They were weighing risk, ROI, and the optics of staying tied to a brand that, overnight, had gone from primetime dominance to a case study in how fast power can crumble when the truth refuses to yield. And in that tense, compressed 24-hour window, the story wasn't just about one explosive interview anymore. It was about what happened when the money and the law both started moving in the same direction, and it wasn't toward the network. The chain reaction had already begun, sponsors distancing themselves, legal voices weighing in, headlines stacking one after another when the inevitable happened. The red tally light on Jeanine Pirro's camera never came back on. One night she was there, her name splashed across the opening graphic, her voice leading the monologue. The next, she was gone. No farewell, no explanation, no on-air handoff. The network didn't release a statement. They didn't even offer the usual vague placeholder about scheduling changes. Her time slot was suddenly filled with recycled episodes and rotating guest hosts who read from scripts as if nothing had changed. Inside the network's halls, the absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Her chair on set stayed empty, the cushion still bearing the faint indent from her last broadcast. Her nameplate was flipped face down on the desk, the engraved letters pressed against the surface like they were hiding from the light. The production team moved around it in silence. No one dared move the chair or clear the desk, not because they were saving her spot, but because touching it might force them to acknowledge what had happened. The control room, usually a hive of chatter during a live show, was quieter now when her time slot came up. No one called camera switches on instinct. The red light above camera 1 stayed cold, and the main monitor showed pre-recorded content, a frozen smile from some unrelated segment playing on a loop. Jeanine's absence wasn't treated like a wound. It was treated like a ghost. You didn't speak about it, but you could feel it, hovering just behind every door. Out in the world, speculation ran wild. Was it suspension? A forced leave? Quiet negotiations to end her contract? Theories ranged from the dramatic to the absurd, but the network stonewalled them all. Their silence wasn't accidental, it was strategy. Without a statement, there was no official story to refute. Without a return date, there was no countdown clock. It was the media version of erasing someone without admitting you'd done it. While Jeanine's presence was being quietly deleted from the airwaves, another kind of email was making its way to a very different inbox. Jasmine Crockett was at her desk when it arrived, no PR team filtering it first, no staffer handing it over in a sealed envelope. The subject line was short, but it stopped her. Invitation to lecture Yale Law School. The body of the email was as direct as it was deliberate. The dean's office was inviting her to deliver a special seminar for their advanced course on media law and ethics. The title was already set: Truth, Power, and Ethics in Legal Media. The note didn't sugarcoat why they wanted her. It referenced recent events that have ignited a national conversation and a live demonstration of accountability within a media framework. They weren't asking for hypotheticals. They were asking for the unvarnished lessons of what she had just done on the most public stage possible. She accepted immediately. The announcement from Yale went out the next morning, and within hours the auditorium RSVP list was full. Law students reserved seats as if it were a trial they couldn't afford to miss. Faculty rearranged office hours. A few reporters, under the guise of academic interest, secured spots in the back row. The air around campus shifted. This wasn't going to be just another lecture. It was going to be a live post-mortem of a moment that had already entered legal media history. When Jasmine arrived at Yale, the weather outside was crisp, the kind that made the old stone buildings look sharper against the sky. She walked into the auditorium without fanfare, dressed simply, carrying a single black folder. The stage was set with a lectern and a modest microphone, but there was no multimedia presentation, no flashy opening. The room didn't need it. The audience was already locked in before she even spoke. She set the folder down on the lectern, looked out at the packed rows, students, professors, and those few carefully disguised reporters, and began without introduction. Her voice was calm, steady, but carried a weight that demanded the room's full attention. Truth is not a brand, she said, each word deliberate. It is a standard. And when power forgets that, the public pays. The line wasn't a rhetorical flourish, it was a thesis. She paused not for effect, but to let the sentence land. You could hear pens scratching against paper as students rushed to capture it. Her eyes moved across the crowd, not lingering on any one person for too long, but making sure they felt the reach of her words. She didn't talk about the confrontation as a spectacle. She framed it as a case study in the collision between legal ethics and media power, how one could be bent by the other until the public no longer knew which was which. She described how systems protect themselves by rewriting the rules mid-game, how credibility is treated as currency, and how easily it can be spent to buy silence or distraction. Her tone sharpened when she addressed the double standard at the core of it all. In my profession, she said, I've watched women, especially women of color, lose their careers over less than a rumor. Meanwhile, others with resources, connections, and the right image can stumble, can fail, can even manipulate, and still walk back into prime time as if nothing happened. There was no mistaking who others referred to, but she didn't have to name Jeanine. Everyone in that room knew. She went on to dissect the legal and ethical breaches, not in emotional terms, but in terms of policy and precedent. She drew lines between on-air conduct and fiduciary duty, between the public's right to truth and the private interest of protecting a brand. She made it clear that what happened in that studio wasn't just about one person's behavior. It was about an entire structure that rewarded the behavior because it served the right interests. Her delivery never faltered. She didn't pace, didn't raise her voice, didn't play to the cameras in the back. She spoke like someone who had nothing to sell and nothing to prove, just a record to set straight. Every point was grounded in evidence. Every argument tethered to a principle that didn't shift depending on who was in the hot seat. By the time she closed the folder, the room was silent in a way that wasn't passive. It was engaged silence, the kind that comes when an audience knows it's just been handed something they'll be unpacking long after they leave. She didn't ask for questions. She didn't need to. The truth she had put into the room would keep working on its own. Jeanine Pirro was still off the air. No date for her return had been announced. And while her absence was barely mentioned by the network, here inside Yale Law School, it was the shadow hanging over every word. A living example of what happens when the rules of power finally meet a challenge they can't silence. The lecture hall was not the same as when Jasmine had first walked in. Hours earlier, it had been buzzing with the restless energy of law students' laptops tapping, whispers trading quick takes on cases, a few smirks from those who weren't sure what to expect from a congresswoman stepping into the domain of legal academia. But now, after nearly 2 hours of her voice cutting through the haze of conventional thinking, the air had shifted. It was denser, heavier, as though every word she had spoken had added weight to the room. Students didn't rush for the doors. Professors stayed seated. Even the janitorial staff waiting at the back to start their night shift paused where they stood. Conversations were subdued, careful, as if no one wanted to speak too loudly and break whatever unspoken current was still flowing. There was a strange electricity in the quiet, like the moment right after a storm, when the air is still charged but the rain has stopped. Jasmine stood at the lectern, her hands resting on a stack of papers she no longer needed. The lecture had ended. The applause had long faded, and yet she hadn't moved. She scanned the rows not to memorize faces, but to see if the words had truly landed. She could tell they had. There was a look she recognized, the same one she'd seen in courtrooms when a jury heard a truth they couldn't unhear. It was part understanding, part unease, part resolve. She began gathering her folder, slipping her notes inside with mechanical precision. But her mind wasn't on packing up. Her mind was still on the last question she'd answered about what it costs to speak when the system is built to mute you. She had said the cost was high, but the cost of staying silent was worse. She had meant it, but she knew the real answer wasn't something you could capture in a neat sentence. As she reached for her pen, a flicker of movement in the front row caught her eye. A young student, barely in their 20s, dark hair falling into their eyes, was sitting still while everyone else shuffled out. They clutched a notebook so tightly the corners had bent. The student's breathing was visible in their shoulders, uneven, like they were working up the courage to speak. Jasmine didn't say anything. She just watched as they rose from their seat and walked slowly toward the stage. The sound of their shoes against the wooden steps echoed in the thinning quiet. By the time they reached the edge of the stage, most of the room had emptied, but there were still enough people lingering that the moment felt public and intimate at the same time. The student stopped just short of her, close enough that Jasmine could see the faint tremor in their hand. They didn't glance around. They didn't look for approval. Their eyes were locked on hers, and when they finally spoke, their voice wavered at first, but then steadied. "You didn't just answer for yourself. You answered for all of us." The words hung there, not as flattery, but as a statement of fact. Jasmine felt them land in her chest. She had been told thank you before. She had been praised, criticized, challenged. But this wasn't about her reputation, her political capital, or her career. This was about representation, not in the abstract, but in the most personal, human sense. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. She was weighing how to respond, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew the weight of this moment. A wrong tone could make it sound performative. A quick dismissal could make it seem she hadn't heard the depth behind the words. So she let the pause stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. Then she set her folder back on the lectern. She stepped forward not in a politician's stride, but in a steady, grounded move that closed the gap between them. Her expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp, the way they always did when she was about to tell a truth she knew might outlive her. She gave the student a small nod before speaking. "And I will keep answering," she said, her voice low but firm, each syllable deliberate, "until no one is silenced." It was not a line rehearsed for applause. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a vow, and the kind of vow that didn't fade once the lights were off. Her tone carried a quiet defiance, the kind that refuses to bend even when no one is watching. In that moment, it wasn't a congresswoman talking to a student. It was one voice telling another, "You are seen, you are heard, and I will stand in front of you if I have to." The student's eyes glistened, not with tears exactly, but with the sharp awareness of being understood in a way that didn't happen often enough. Their grip on the notebook loosened slightly, like the tension in their body had found an exit. Around them, the remaining few in the hall had stopped pretending to pack up or check their phones. They were watching, listening, taking in the exchange like it was as much for them as for the two people speaking. The room itself seemed as still, as if the walls were absorbing the words. Outside, the faint whistle of wind pushed against the old glass panes of the building, the sound carrying in through the gaps in the frame. It was the kind of weather that made people pull their coats tighter, but inside there was a strange warmth, not from the heating system, but from the raw humanity that had just passed between two strangers on a stage. Jasmine didn't look away from the student immediately. She held the connection for another beat, long enough to make sure the message was received in full. Then she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. One of those rare smiles that wasn't about charm or diplomacy, but about knowing, deep down, that something had been set in motion here, something that couldn't be undone. The student nodded almost imperceptibly and stepped back, the sound of their shoes against the stage quieter this time. They didn't rush away. They walked slowly toward the aisle, glancing once over their shoulder before disappearing into the thinning crowd. Jasmine stayed where she was, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the lectern, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her hand. She wasn't in a hurry to leave now. Moments like this didn't come often, and when they did, they weren't just for the people on the receiving end. They were reminders for her, too, of why she had chosen to keep speaking, even when the cost was steep. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a chair scraped against the floor. A professor murmured something to a colleague. The world outside was already moving on, as it always did. But here, for just a little longer, the air stayed charged, holding on to the promise she had spoken, a promise that now belonged to more than just her. The air in the lecture hall still trembled in the wake of Jasmine's last exchange with the young student. It was the kind of ending that didn't feel like an ending at all, more like the opening note of something no one could yet name. The applause had faded minutes ago, but the atmosphere had not settled. It hummed, as though the walls themselves were reluctant to let the words go. Students gathered their bags slowly, eyes unfocused, as if they were carrying more than notebooks out of that room. Conversation stayed hushed, not because anyone told them to be quiet, but because they knew they had just witnessed something that deserved silence, a silence of processing, not avoidance. The lesson Jasmine had delivered wasn't a neat, pre-packaged takeaway wrapped in careful rhetoric. It was messy, demanding, and personal. "Truth doesn't wait for permission," she had said earlier, and that line had not only landed, it had taken root. In the dim light of the hall, some students replayed it in their minds, realizing how many times they had sat on something they knew needed to be said, waiting for a moment that felt safer. They could see now what she meant. Safe moments rarely come, and when they do, they're often too late. Truth arrives in moments of chaos, when saying it could cost you something, and that's when it matters most. This wasn't an abstract academic exercise. Jasmine had shown them that truth-telling in the real world was not a career move, it was a risk, and the risk didn't end with the applause. In her voice, they had heard not just conviction, but the fatigue of someone who had spent years standing in rooms where the price of honesty was isolation. She didn't romanticize it. She told them plainly, "The system doesn't reward you for speaking up. It exhausts you, tests you, tries to grind you down until you either quit or compromise." But then she had leaned forward, eyes steady, and said, If you survive the storm, you become the storm. It wasn't bravado, it was a statement of survival, and in the way she said it, you could tell it was both a warning and a promise. In that moment, the human part of her message cut through sharper than any of the legal analysis. This wasn't just about winning an argument or exposing hypocrisy. It was about what happens to a person when they refuse to be moved. Justice, she made clear, isn't a single act. It's a grind. It's coming back day after day when the cameras are gone and the allies are quieter and choosing to keep going anyway. That was the weight in her words. Persistence is not glamorous, but it is undefeated. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats when she spoke about silence. Silence is not neutral, she had told them. It sides with whoever benefits from it most. It was the kind of sentence that didn't need volume to hit like a gavel. It forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that not speaking out isn't a neutral act. It's an active choice that protects someone. And often, that someone is the very person doing the harm. People began thinking about their own silences, the arguments they didn't step into, the rumors they let slide, the injustices they thought were someone else's fight. And here was the dangerous part. She didn't let them walk away thinking this was only about her fight. By the time she finished, they could all see themselves somewhere in her story. Maybe they weren't facing down network hosts or political power, but they knew the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, or told to stay in their lane. They knew what it was to watch a wrong and calculate whether speaking up was worth the trouble. Jasmine had shattered that calculation, showing them that the real cost wasn't in speaking, it was in the years you spend afterward wishing you had. This was why the hall didn't just empty, it leaked out slowly, like people trying not to break something fragile they were carrying. The echoes of her voice followed them out into the crisp night, threading through groups as they walked toward the library, the dorms, the city. They didn't all agree on every point she made she hadn't asked them to, but they couldn't deny the shift in the air. She had moved the conversation from theory to obligation, from what if to what now. The beauty and the danger of her presence was that she didn't end with a list of instructions. She understood something most speakers never grasp. The most powerful calls to action are the ones people write for themselves. Instead of telling them exactly what to do, she had left them with a choice they could feel in their bones. You either carry this forward or you let it die. And letting it die would be on you, not on the world, not on the system, on you. For those who were ready, her words would not fade. They would show up weeks later in a classroom when someone made a lazy, biased remark. They would surface at a family dinner when the conversation turned ugly and everyone else looked down at their plates. They would be there in the meeting room, in the courtroom, in the newsroom, anywhere someone realized they could no longer be the person who stayed quiet. That was the seed she had planted, and she knew seeds like that were unpredictable. They didn't sprout where you expected. They grew through cracks in the concrete. They turned up in places the architects of silence had long stopped watching. And for those who weren't ready, the seed would still be there, waiting. That's the thing about moments like this, they don't disappear. They wait in the back of your mind until the day you can no longer ignore them. Even the ones who resisted her message tonight would hear her voice again, maybe years from now, when they stood at their own crossroads. The truth, once seen in full light, can be avoided, but it cannot be unseen. As Jasmine finally left the building, her pace was unhurried. The coat draped over her arms swayed with each step, and her eyes carried the calm of someone who knew she had done what she came to do. She didn't need to turn around to know that she had left something behind. Not a performance, not a headline, a charge, a living, breathing challenge that was now the property of everyone who had been in that room. She had walked in as a speaker, but she was leaving as something more dangerous, a reminder. And reminders have a way of showing up exactly when they're least convenient for those who fear them most. The night air outside was sharp and clear, but inside the hall, the heat of her presence lingered. Chairs still sat slightly askew from where students had leaned forward without realizing it. A few loose pages of notes had been left behind, covered in scribbles that weren't just quotes, they were declarations. Words circled, underlined, starred. Some had written, "Truth doesn't wait," in the corner of their pages as if making a pact. Others had written her line about silence, each letter pressed hard into the paper, The kind of writing you don't forget, even when you forget the page. That was the real victory of the night. Not the applause, not the invitations that would inevitably follow, but the quiet knowledge that somewhere in the city, a young man was walking home thinking about the person he'd been too afraid to defend. That a young woman was on the phone with her mother, finally saying something she had kept in for years. That a law student was staring at his laptop, rewriting his paper because he suddenly realized the argument he had been making was too safe, too easy, too polite to matter. The moral wasn't delivered like a sermon, it was lived in real time, right there in front of them. That's why it would last. Because people don't just remember what you told them. They remember how you made them feel about what's possible. Tonight, Jasmine had made them feel that something they thought was immovable could actually be moved. And once you felt that, even for a second, you can't go back to pretending it can't be done. The air after Jasmine's final words still felt electric, like the static before a lightning strike. That moment hadn't just ended a confrontation, it had planted something in the minds of everyone watching. And now, as the noise faded, what was left wasn't just the story of one woman standing her ground. It was a question, raw and unavoidable. What happens if we all decide to do nothing? That silence had weight. It pressed down on the chest. Not because it was empty, but because it was full of the truth that the next move wasn't hers anymore. It was ours. The lesson wasn't abstract. Jasmine hadn't just exposed a double standard in a TV studio, she had shown how those same double standards live in workplaces, schools, courtrooms, and city councils. They hide in the hiring decisions made behind closed doors. They slip into the jokes no one calls out. They appear in the excuses people make to avoid speaking up because speaking up is risky. But her point was clear. Risk doesn't go away when you stay quiet. It simply shifts. It falls on someone else, someone with less power, fewer resources, and fewer chances to recover. That's not neutrality. That's participation. It's easy to watch a moment like this and call it bravery, as if bravery is a rare skill, reserved for people like her. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to stay comfortable. Bravery isn't born in a TV studio or under bright lights, it's born in the seconds you decide to act, even when no one's looking. It's the email you send when you know your boss will hate it. It's the friend you defend in a room full of silence. It's the rule you question when everyone else is pretending it makes sense. Jasmine's fight wasn't about one broadcast. It was about showing how ordinary people can push back in ordinary moments until those moments stop feeling ordinary at all. She had put the burden back where it belonged, on the audience, on the citizens, on anyone who has ever muttered someone should do something while waiting for someone else to do it. If you have a voice, you have a role. If you have a choice, you have responsibility. And if you have power, even the smallest kind, you have to decide which side of the table you're on. Because power isn't neutral. It's always being used for something. The question is whether you're letting it be used without you even knowing. The challenge now wasn't just to applaud Jasmine. It was to replicate her impact in places where no cameras roll. Imagine what happens if the same refusal to be silenced spreads to every school board meeting, every workplace HR session, every council vote on housing or healthcare. The walls that seem immovable are often held up by nothing more than the habit of compliance. Break the habit, and the wall isn't as solid as it looks. Jasmine didn't just chip a brick, she showed that the mortar's already cracking. But here's the part no one likes to talk about. Doing this will cost you. You will lose friends. You will lose opportunities. People will question your motives, your sanity, and sometimes your decency. They will tell you to calm down, to be strategic, to wait for a better time. That time won't come. Every moment you wait is a moment the same systems you're afraid to confront grow stronger. Jasmine didn't wait for the perfect time to speak. She spoke when it was messy, when it was dangerous, when the odds were against her. That's why it worked. This is the point where you decide whether you want to be a spectator or a participant. Spectators get to keep their hands clean, but they also keep their voices useless. Participants get dirty. They make mistakes. They take hits, but they also get to change the ending. That's the trade. And if this story has shown anything, it's that the ending doesn't write itself. It's written by the people willing to stand in the line of fire and say, enough. The call isn't for everyone to become Jasmine Crockett. The call is for everyone to become their own version of that force for their family, their community, their workplace. It starts small. Speak up in a meeting where someone gets cut off. Call out the policy that doesn't make sense. Support the person being targeted, even if you're not sure you'll say it perfectly. It's not about perfection, it's about momentum. One act begets another. Courage is contagious, but only if it's visible. You don't need a platform to make a dent. Platforms are built from the dents people make together. And sometimes all it takes is one person breaking the silence for others to realize they were never alone. That's how movements are born, not from speeches or slogans, but from repeated, relentless interruptions of the status quo. Every time you refuse to play along with an injustice, you add weight to the side of the scale that has been empty for too long. This is where you step in. If you're reading this, you've already seen what silence allows. You've already watched what happens when one person decides not to play by the rules designed to keep them small. The question is whether you'll be that person the next time the moment finds you. And it will find you. It may not be on TV. It may not be in a courtroom. It might be in your office kitchen, at a school board meeting, on a crowded bus, but it will come. And when it does, you will either keep the balance as it is, or you will tip it. That choice is yours, not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Now. Because every delay is a vote for the status quo, whether you admit it or not. And every action, even the smallest one, is a signal to others that the rules can be challenged, that the script can be rewritten, that the weight of what has always been is not unshakable. The fight for justice doesn't happen in speeches, it happens in decisions. So here's the truth. No one is coming to save you from making that decision. There is no hero waiting in the wings. There's you. There's the moment. And there's the choice. Jasmine showed that the choice to speak can upend the room. You can do the same, maybe not to millions, but to the one person who needs to hear it most. And sometimes that's enough to start an avalanche. The crowd didn't disperse right away. They lingered, as if the air still held a charge that no one wanted to lose. A few clutched their phones not to record, but to hold them like anchors as though the moment might drift away if they didn't keep it in their grasp. Jasmine stood at the edge of the stage, not speaking now, just watching them. It wasn't pride in her eyes, it was responsibility. Every face staring back at her was a reminder that the fight wasn't over, that this was only one victory in a field that stretched far beyond the walls of this room. A young man in the front row raised his hand, not for a question, but in a quiet salute. She nodded back, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Somewhere in the back, an older woman began to clap, not the quick, scattered applause of an audience that had been entertained, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone honoring a truth they had waited too long to hear. The sound grew, one pair of hands at a time, until the room was filled with it. Jasmine didn't raise her hands for quiet. She didn't need to. She stepped forward once more, her voice steady, carrying not the heat of confrontation now, but the weight of a promise. "This isn't the end," she said, scanning the faces in front of her. "If you walk out of here tonight and go back to silence, then all we've done is tell a story. But if you walk out and carry this truth forward, then we've started something they can't stop." And for a moment, the silence returned, not empty, not awkward, but full. A silence that felt like a seed being planted. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.